Well, we'll get started, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for being here. My name is John Paul MacDonald. I'm with Bombardier. We're a global manufacturer, trains and planes. We're the largest rail equipment manufacturer in the world and the third largest aerospace manufacturer after Boeing and Airbus. The reason I tell you that is because this particular subject interests me greatly as a global manufacturer, because we're going to be looking at today, as what was called in the title of the panel, full circle manufacturing migrates around the globe. And we have a fine panel today to help us reflect on this. I can't help but refer to the final sentence of the description of this panel, which says, "This panel will map the pathways of manufacturing and explore where the industries of the future will flourish." I think it's a bit of a tall order, so I want to manage expectations here. But what we're looking at to have today is a lively debate with our fine panel members. And I will start with some introductions. So from left to right, your left to right, we have Damien Chan. Damien is the International Director for the Americas for the Singapore Economic Development Board. I believe you're in San Francisco. It's your office?
Yes, that's where I'm based.
And in his 17 years with the EDB, he has headed up their offices in Dallas and Chicago as well, and was director of the Electronics Cluster Group that oversaw the promotion and development of the Singapore electronics industry. And next to him is Zachary Carabel, President, River Twice Research, an economic research and consulting company, and River Twice Capital Advisors, a money management firm. He is an author and teacher focusing on economics, investing, history, and international relations. He is also a senior fellow here at the Milken Institute and a regular commentator on CNBC and contributor to The Atlantic, Reuters, The New York Times, among many others. To my immediate right, Ron Kirk, Senior of Counsel at Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher, where he provides strategic counsel to companies with global interests. Prior to joining the firm, about a month ago, Ron was the first African American to serve as U.S. trade representative and a member of President Obama's cabinet, serving as the president's principal trade advisor and negotiator, as well as spokesman on trade issues. He has a long career in public service and diverse legislative and economic experience at the local, state, and federal levels, most notably in Texas, where he was Secretary of State under the administration of Governor Ann Richards, and also Mayor of Dallas, I believe, for 6 years. To my left, John Manley. John is President and CEO of the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, representing the CEOs and entrepreneurs of 150 leading Canadian corporations. A former Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, John served as Minister in 3 cabinet portfolios, that of Industry, Foreign Affairs, and Finance. He also chaired a special cabinet committee on public security and anti-terrorism, serving as Canada's counterpart to Tom Ridge, the first U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security. Since leaving government, John has continued to be active in public policy as a media commentator, speaker, and advisor to governments of differing political stripes. And finally, but certainly not least, Eyal Ophir. Eyal is the chairman of Global Holdings, Inc. and Zodiac Maritime Agencies Limited. He has more than 35 years of experience in international shipping and real estate, and oversees one of the largest privately held shipping fleets in the world, with more than 150 ocean-going vessels trading worldwide. His other interest is in Global Holdings, a US-based company that specializes in large-scale commercial real estate and high-end residential developments, including prime properties in Manhattan, and a controlling stake in Miller Global Properties, a real estate investment fund focusing on North America and Europe. So as we can see, my company, or me as a manufacturer, I'm surrounded by quite a variety of individuals with very differing points of view. So I'm going to get started with a few questions, a question for each of our panelists, and then we'll see where the discussion goes from there. And Zachary, I'd like to start with you, if I may. Many Americans believe that in order to maintain a strong and prosperous country, a strong and vibrant manufacturing sector is needed. And there is talk now that manufacturing is enjoying a renaissance or a rebirth in the United States. I'm wondering, is that myth or reality? And even if manufacture is coming back to the U.S., are the jobs coming back with them?
So thank you.
It's interesting. Yesterday, Morgan Stanley released a 125-page blue paper. I don't know why it's a blue paper or white paper. It's all PDF on the computer, so really its color is inconsequential. But they called it a blue paper. And the title was Manufacturing Renaissance or Head Fake. Can we go to slide number 8? I can do that, right? There's someone to do slides. Just as a way of illustrating. So I think, one of the real questions here, and Time Magazine had a cover story. I think I have friends who work at Time, so they did that for this panel. It obviously, didn't fill up the room, but at least you all are here. Saying U.S. manufacturing is back and where the jobs are. And it's certainly true that manufacturing has ceased to bleed jobs. But, even then, the cessation of loss is not exactly the same as the creation of gain. If we can go to slide 9, there obviously has been a tad of manufacturing growth that's been notable compared to the past years, really the past 9 years, 10 years. And I think if you were to do that back into the 1990s, you'd have the same thing. So the issue really is, even with manufacturing having kind of bottomed as a source of real significant job loss, is it ever going to be a source of substantial job gain? And I think there you have to look at this in conjunction with the fact that manufacturing was about 18 to 19 million jobs in 1970 and a workforce that was in about the mid-70s. So there was about 1 in every 4 jobs was manufacturing in 1970. 2013, there are a little less than 12 million manufacturing jobs as determined by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. There's about 131 million people in the workforce, which means that about 8% are now manufacturing jobs. So no matter how much of this you get over the coming years, whether you get 50,000 a month for the next 30 years, manufacturing as a share of overall employment is not going to be very large. What's complicated about this is that even as you have a tendency now toward onshoring or the cessation of offshoring, you don't have the kind of job creation that comes with it. So the same factory that opens up today in a local town that's been wooed heavily might employ 500 people with a lot of robotics, just-in-time manufacturing, a lot of complicated, sort of high-skilled jobs. That same factory might have employed 2,000 or 3,000 people 30 or 40 years ago because there wasn't as much robotics. So you could have this situation of high-level output, low-level employment that will look good for GDP. It will benefit us collectively in some sort of aggregate form, but it will not be the kind of job creator that it has been in the past. And one final point, small point, even there, part of the optic that's distorting is even when manufacturing goes offshore, because the United States in particular is still generating a lot of intellectual property, whether or not China is stealing that, that a lot of the value of that intellectual property doesn't show up in the way in which we look at manufacturing trade. So an iPhone enters the port of Long Beach south of here, it shows up as a $200 import from China. Even though when the OEC breaks down and the Asian Development Bank and Ron Kirk's office breaks down actually where the value goes of that iPhone, maybe $15 goes to China. A lot of that $200 actually goes to the United States, whether it's Apple and the intellectual property. But that's invisible in trade numbers. So there's a lot of this relationship that's changed a lot in ways that are unfamiliar and that I think we're still digesting.
Thanks, Zach. Ron, I'd like to turn to you. You were President Obama's point man on free trade. A lot of proponents, a lot of people against free trade. 87% of global economic growth over the next 5 years will come from outside the United States. And is free trade the answer for that?
Well, in many Americans' minds, it is completely counterintuitive to equate free trade with being the answer to our concerns about job growth. And so our recalibrating our approach and message about trade was more than wordsmithing, but having to make a convincing case to the American public that if you had a different kind of trade policy that took into account, and thank you for letting Zachary go first, all of the dynamics that Zachary said, at least you could make a compelling case that if you have a trade policy that didn't intuit in many Americans' minds incentivize all the jobs going elsewhere, trade can be a part of the answer. And I don't come to this from the academic background of others, and your introduction was kind, but y'all should focus more on the part where he introduced me as a mayor. Mayors don't talk about macro policy. We talk about jobs and cars and houses. because that's what the people that we work with think about every day. And the more that we can have trade policy that takes into account all the dynamics that he's talked about in onshoring and inherent in that discussion, investments in education and infrastructure that are necessary to even have the factories with the 500 jobs. And the more that we can convince the American public that a big part of our future is the reality that we want to compete, as President Obama says, for the 95%. And that's the 95% of consumers who now live somewhere other than the United States, then that trade can be a part of it. And I think we've begun to build a more compelling case about that. But it is important when you talk about trade for those of us who believe in it. Typically, if you talk to an audience and you ever utter the words free trade, you have lost that audience. And I'll tell you one story and I'll stop. I come in the office, I wanted this job. It's the only thing I lobbied for. But 2008, most people thought we weren't going to have a trade policy because they just assumed labor had us in a headlock. President Obama, with a Democratic Congress, wouldn't move trade agreements. And I go into the most pro-trade environment, and the chamber and everybody else is going, Kirk, damn it, cut the brake lines, let's get going. And I had to convince the people that worked in my office that we needed to talk and think differently about trade. So I invited a number of different people to come in and just talk to us about trade and where it was going. Most important was a group called The Third Way. And The Third Way had done a poll, and it was a bit dated. It was about 18 months old. And they just asked Americans a number of questions, but three of which resonated with me. One, they asked them, do you believe you'd win the lottery? And we all know what the odds are. It's one in whatever hundreds of millions. And twice as many people answered yes, that they thought they'd win the lottery, than answered, I believe trade has been good for America. And I had my whole team assembled. That didn't shake them so much. What really kicked us in the gut, and this is true, they asked, do you believe in the existence of UFOs and extraterrestrial beings? And you believe the government's lying to us? They've got something out there in New Mexico they're not telling us. 3 times as many people answered that they believed in the existence of UFOs than that trade on balance was good for America. So one, I wanted our team to understand what we were facing.
Wrong job.
No, well, I would tell you, at the end of it, I'm proud of the fact that we passed 3 trade agreements with Korea, Colombia, and Panama, and did so with the largest margins in history. And one was basically addressing the concerns around this issue of us being able to retain some of the jobs here rather than people believing we get cheaper T-shirts and laptops, but all the jobs going to China. But we are seeing, because of this one factor, and I'll stop, if intellectual property and protection of that is at the core of your business model, there is a bias more now of being in an environment in which that is protected and you have some of the best workers in the world. And that's an area that America can win in.
Great. Damien, you oversaw the development of the electronics, the promotion of the electronics industry in Singapore, helping it, bringing it to where it is today. Perhaps you could comment a bit on the impact of innovation, the creative side towards manufacturing, and the way forward for the future.
Yes. So, firstly, before I go specifically in electronics, perhaps let's talk a bit about how Singapore sees the manufacturing sector as well and its role in the economy, because the electronics industry is in a sense also a microcosm of Singapore's manufacturing sector. So firstly, for the Singapore Economic Development Board, we have been around for 52 years, and our charter during that 52 years has always been about industry development, for which manufacturing was a core part of it, right? And so since the 60s. And today when we look at manufacturing in Singapore, we don't look at it just purely as production, but also all parts of the value chain, from your R&D, your product development, process development, manufacturing, as well as going down to the more downstream activities like sales and marketing and headquarters type services. So when we look at manufacturing then, it's not just about creating production jobs, but really creating the ancillary spin-offs as well to the sector. So while because of technological improvements, and it's going back to also Zachary's point as well, you don't see actually a lot of production jobs being created, but in Singapore there are actually a lot of spin-offs to the logistics industry, to R&D, for instance. We see that R&D, manufacturing is critical for us to be able to access the latest technologies and so to create IP, to create R&D jobs in Singapore as well. And similarly, when I look at the electronics industry, at the development of it, we look at it as an ecosystem. Okay, it's not just about bringing in for instance, the semiconductor manufacturers like the foundries or the packaging and test houses, but bringing in also the customers to the manufacturers, like the fabless companies, some of which are actually not too far from here in Southern California, like your Broadcom, your Qualcomm, who have regional headquarters functions. But because of the presence of the manufacturing partners in Singapore and in the region, whether we talk about Southeast Asia, Taiwan, or China, that's why they actually set up teams which do some chip design, test development, process development together with their partners, manufacturing partners, and that creates that something what we call a virtuous cycle, where it's because of the manufacturing partners we bring in more of their customers, and because there are more customers here, then more manufacturing comes as well. So it creates that kind of virtuous cycle, which then helps create not just jobs to say, but create sustainable jobs, which is the key thing for us.
And has there been a transformation at Singapore going? Because Singapore, the image we have of Singapore is very much as a services hub. And has there been kind of like a transformation in manufacturing, whereby, by latest estimates, I believe 20% of GDP in Singapore is in manufacturing?
So today, about 21% of Singapore's GDP is manufacturing. And the government and our Prime Minister himself has stated many times, the medium to long-term intent is to keep manufacturing at between 20 to 25% of the share of GDP. So that will not change for precisely the reasons I mentioned, because I mean it creates good jobs, creates spin-offs to the rest of the economy, and also allows us to continue to go into areas like R&D, for instance. Yeah. The other thing is actually for manufacturing. If you look at the previous recessions which Singapore had gone through, there was the dot-com bust. There was also the Great Recession in 2008. During the recovery period, it was manufacturing which actually had led the growth, or had led the recovery for Singapore. Like in 2010, well, a lot of it, you may know that Singapore recorded probably, I think, the second highest GDP growth in the world in that year, about close to 15%. Manufacturing actually grew by close to 30%. Yeah. So we see a lot of, that's why we see a lot of value from manufacturing. But at the same time, I mean, we don't, given the cost structure in Singapore, I think now it's still not as expensive as, let's say, the US, but still, I mean, it's not that far off, and definitely relative to the rest of Asia, I think we are one of the more expensive countries. Not all types of manufacturing can be done in Singapore. That's why we also work on working with our neighboring countries to leverage on the different strengths, to see what parts of the value chain perhaps can be done in our neighboring countries, and perhaps some other parts could be done in Singapore.
Great, yeah. Thank you. I'd like to turn to John now, who, John, you have an organization where you're seeing Canadian CEOs all the time, entrepreneurs. What are they telling you about manufacturing, particularly global manufacturing? And I wonder also if you could address specifically from the point of view of the training, the manpower, and that the proverbial war for talent.
Yeah, thank you, John Paul. I think what I'd start with, what I'd say off the top, is that we're at a point in the evolution of how we go about making things that is in some ways parallel to what happened in North America in the early 20th century, when we had a massive transfer of people out of agriculture and into manufacturing. And if you look at North American economies in the early 20th century, you had 80 to 90% of the workforce being in agriculture. They were not highly productive. That's where people made their living. And gradually that shifted to the point that number became rather minuscule, but far more productive. I think we've seen a similar thing happening in the manufacturing sector. And at the same time, we're seeing a complete transformation in the kinds of people, the kinds of skills that are required to do the jobs that are being created in manufacturing. Now, the good news is there are a lot of really highly skilled people out there to take these jobs. Just put up slide number 35, if you would. Let me introduce you to one of those high-skilled workers. His name is Baxter. He's made by Rethink Robotics in Boston. And this is why there's such a transformation in the nature of the workforce that's in demand. Baxter only costs about $22,000. He's capable of being trained by ordinary workers. They don't have to be high-tech engineers. They don't have to be software designers. He can be taught to do a lot of basic tasks very quickly and very readily at a very low cost. So who do we need for manufacturing jobs? We need people that have a lot more skill than Baxter currently has. If you go to slide 36, you see why this actually is a problem, because if you look at this slide, a little hard to see, I think, on that screen, but let's put it this way. It's a projection going out, and the bars on top, the green bars, are the unskilled workforce that's expected to be available over the coming decades. The light red bar, which is the longer one in each case, is the need for skilled workers. The dark red bar is the difference. Now, if you look at the pair of bars closest to the farthest to the left, you'll see that they're actually kind of in balance. There is a need for more skilled workers, but there's actually about the same number of unskilled workers there, and you kind of get to a balance in the workforce. So you could say, well, there's a little bit of a misalignment here between the skills that are available and the skills that are required. But the great thing, I mean, we're not very good at really predicting, interest rates or GDP growth or even trade statistics. But the great thing about demographics is it's pretty predictable. And when you look at the demographic trends, you overlay them. These are numbers for the United States. What you see is that over the course of the decades to come, we've got a really serious skill shortage. And we've got a lot of workers that are unskilled that are going to be wondering what to do with their time. This is, for my money, this is the most serious public policy challenge that governments in developed, mature economies are facing, because we've got jobs without people and we've got people without jobs, and that makes for first of all, it limits growth, and secondly, it makes for unhappy people, the kind that the ambassador was referring to, that are concerned about how they're going to buy their houses, where their jobs are going to, where their kids are going to work. These are not people that are going to be happy if we don't address that challenge, and that's going to be key to what policymakers have to address in ensuring that we have the skilled workers to do the jobs that are going to be created in this manufacturing revolution.
All right. And as technology goes on, I mean, think about Baxter and the next generation. We're going to have this whole trend of unemployed robots that we're going to have to be dealing with, and we haven't even begun to.
Fortunately, they don't vote.
Haven't faced that. Well, not yet. I mean, in some states,
And if they don't
seem
develop
to.
cognitive skills, they won't know they're unemployed. So.
So as you can see, so far we've gone in this manufacturing discussion from innovation, free trade, are there going to be jobs when the manufacturing comes home, to the skill shortage. And now I'd like to address Eyal, and you have over 150 ships in your fleet, and I've heard a lot, maybe you could talk a bit about better route planning, better automation, more fuel efficient ships. How is that going to help the manufacturers to continue, particularly those manufacturers who have global supply chains, and enable them to keep their costs down?
Very relevant question and a very serious issue. First of all, I'm lucky I don't have to deal with government policies and likes, and it will make my life very complicated.
Yes, you are.
But in response to your question, shipping as such, is the main artery facilitating all that takes place between the various economies, continents, etc. Without shipping, those arteries, those industries, and those continents will not be able to survive. Now, shipping is an industry that rarely reinvents itself. It has been a process which for the last 60 to 100 years have been following its own footsteps with very little innovation, because there was no need for innovation. There was no need for reducing the impact on the environment. There was no need for particular efficiencies. And everything which did go into improving the shipping process or clearing the arteries and facilitating transportation was through innovation innovation of port facilities and train and rail and containerization. The last major evolution in shipping was containerization. The current world economy forced shipping into radical change. Routes had to be shortened dramatically in order to save fuel. Cost of energy has tripled, if not quadrupled, all of which called for major and radical changes in ships' design and ships' consumption. On top of it, the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal, which is the main artery of transportation, of marine transportation between east and west and north and south, will now double in its capacity. And vessels which before, until now, has been restricted in size due to the size of the canal, will become redundant, because the canal have practically doubled itself, and even more than that, in its capacity, which, combined with the fact that engines have become much more efficient, speed of vessels have been reduced by 60%, stability of the vessels have increased due to their ability to widen the vessel width, which will now fit into the Panama Canal, all of which have brought the cost of transportation down significantly, which helps and facilitates the world economy and the global economy in operating in the most efficient fashion. And why? Because you're talking about industries. Industries as such, and in the modern days, are no longer confined to a country. Today, industries are practically assembly lines, where the sourcing of are most placed and best placed in countries which have the relative advantage in production. So if, for example, you take a Ford car manufacturer in the UK, very little is made in the UK. Engines are made in Vietnam, the tires are made in Singapore, right? The electronics are made in Germany, and so on and so forth. What happens? Everybody puts it in the container and has a timely delivery into the factory. What the English do, make a car made in England with components sourced elsewhere. This is what it amounts to. And now that the global economy has had to slow down so significantly, and pollution has become a source of major effort worldwide, shipping have reinvented itself.
So I assume you still very much are a proponent, or you believe that the continuity of a global value chain of companies that are situated with suppliers and installations around the world there's no repatriation of manufacturing coming back necessarily.
I don't know. Look, when it comes to government policies, you tend to see that protectionism may be creeping in to some extent, either through quotas or through imposition of added value taxes and the likes, which in my view may hinder progress and efficiencies and costs. But I'm a great proponent of sourcing and making the most out of everyone's ability to produce whatever he can to the best he can.
John Paul, if I could just
go ahead.
add one comment on that, at least in the context of my former job, one of the elements that we are fighting in the trade world is the rise of what we see now we call localization measures. And principally because people associate manufacturing with jobs and wanting more of those jobs to stay in their own country is more and more of an imposition. And John Paul's car analogy was a great one, and you'll see more and more of it where they'll say X percentage of this car has to be made in the United States or Canada or whatever. And irrespective of that, it's very difficult to define how you come up with what's made in America when they are sourced all over the country. But one of the disciplines that we, at least as the United States, have tried to bring about in our discussions with other countries and new trade agreements is to combat that and let that be a business decision and not have policies that unfairly tilt that decision one way or the other, so that it's made on reasonable commercial business terms and not for own country specific terms.
That is
Zach?
one of the things that complicates modern trade agreements as well, as you know, particularly in North America in the auto sector, where we've got a highly integrated supply chain of vehicle parts and assembly, so that within NAFTA, you'll find that a typical motor vehicle, when you add up all of its bits and parts and things that have moved around across borders from Mexico to the U.S. or from the U.S. into Canada and back again, components, subcomponents, they get assembled, they finally roll off an assembly line, go to a customer. All those bits and parts have crossed one of the two borders on average 7 times. So what's made in Canada? Its parts have come from Mexico and the U.S., but its final assembly was in Canada or in the U.S. So when we sit down, as we're currently doing on the Canadian side with the European Union, and you're starting to talk about rules of origin in the auto sector, it's not that hard for a European automaker, despite the fact some of the parts may come from Vietnam. A lot of it's coming from within the 27 European economies. North America, to say that an automobile was made in Canada, it's a tough case to make, because in fact we make them together in North America. Yeah. And it's going to be very important for trade agreements to understand the reality of those kinds of supply chains and accommodate them in rules of origin in order to make sure that we actually do get the benefits of liberalizing trade.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really important point, which I tried to briefly touch on when I was talking about just the iPhone examples, the supply chain. Our trade statistics, the way in which we view manufacturing and supply chains is really rooted in the origin point when we started collecting these numbers in any rigorous fashion, which is really kind of the mid-20th century, when national economies tended to make their stuff, and they could make it competitively, and they had exports, but still, you made stuff where it was near to where it was being sold. And the idea today that almost anything actually has a country of origin, unless it's a grain, and even then you could say if it's Monsanto's seed technology, even that may not be grown in the country. I mean, it's grown in the country it's grown in, but its origin may be somewhere else, is a real problem, in that most of the things we consume are kind of made in many places, and the way in which the trade office has to, and the customs department has to deal with these things, is this country where something has its last major substantive transformation, I think is the term of art. But it doesn't get to the fact that any electronic component you have, any higher technology, any car is likely made in 20 different countries or 30 different countries. And that's not going to change no matter how much onshoring you have, because we're not going to suddenly localize every single supply chain in the world. And the other part that's a problem, I want to go to slide 22, is that what this ties into is we're so rooted in the belief that our economies rest on manufacturing as the productive base for what we're doing, because that's what is in our kind of cultural DNA as what we remember creating a productive economy. And even these statistics, are kind of, I think, radically understate what the multiplier effect is from information technology, because frankly, information technology and services and all of this have been around for 20 years. So we have no idea what the multiplier effect is. We have an intuitive sense of it being huge, right? You talked about the shipping industry, but we don't have a way of statistically proving that it's huge, whereas we do have a way of statistically proving that manufacturing is big. And there are now 2 million farmers in the United States who produce way more food than 30 million farmers did, or 20 million farmers did in 1900. And we no longer think of ourselves as a farming nation, but we did 80 years ago. Oh my God, what was going to happen when the farms go away was one of the huge issues of the Great Depression. Not an issue now, because our economy went through a series of not always pleasant transitions. And I think, we're essentially what's happening is the same thing with manufacturing, but we're so not there yet in either the way in which we can measure value, the trade statistics, or in the way in which we can culturally think of where value comes from in our economic lives.
That's what I find very interesting, is can we explain this, or how can we dispel this myth? Because a lot of people are talking, and
if people have a job, they tend to not care. I hate to bring it, when people are employed, they tend to not care. And if they aren't employed, then they do care. And then that creates, if you heard Tony Blair's presentation, there is in the pure manufacturing sense of what makes sense, this isn't hard. It gets difficult in the political sense when people say, you're going to come in, you're going to juice the economy. Well, damn it, if we're going to go spend $800 billion, then we should put into every piece a Buy America clause that says we should buy all of it, and everyone nods their head and shakes their heads. And then John Manley calls me, and my buddies from Mexico call me and say, Kirk, what the hell are y'all doing? You're going to disrupt North America. And it's hard if you're Dave Dreyer, who I saw come in, to go to a town hall in which there are a lot of angry people, more anxious than ever, and can't understand. What's so wrong with just saying that if we've got to prop up our economy for a short period of time, that you don't insist that every widget, water pipe, car that we buy is made in America? What's so wrong with that? And then you got this commie trade rep up there who's being romanced by his buddies in Singapore that won't do it. But it gets terribly complex.
But it's to my two former politicians here, when you hear politicians, public servants.
They didn't pay me enough to be.
That's right. You're right. Sorry, you're right. Yeah, you were close enough. You were in the cabinet. But it's just this idea of saying that American manufacturing is coming home. This is great. Happy days are here again, and that sort of thing. I mean. Is this misleading the public?
And I don't want to dominate. To me, what's more important is to stop the fiction that American manufacturing is dead, because that feeds the whole notion. Because good or bad, and I grew up in Texas. I was a mayor of Dallas, so it's easy for me to be a free trader. Best thing happened to me was marrying a woman from Detroit and going to Pittsburgh. No, I'm serious, because if you go to Pittsburgh and you go to Detroit, you understand these people have a reason to be angry. But if they've been told for 20 years, I was in Detroit and I was debating someone on the merits of trade, and they ran the same ad they all do. This factory shut down because of NAFTA. And I said, that factory closed in 1976. NAFTA wasn't passed until 1990. But it's easy if you haven't run your business, to blame everything, but to blame everything on NAFTA. And everyone buys into that, and so but we've got to deal with that in a world in which people associate almost every job loss in America and the degradation of our cities and our communities because of we get cheaper T-shirts and give the jobs everywhere else. You've got to help them. To me, the more difficult argument is helping people understand manufacturing is alive, but because of automation and other things, that factory 20 years ago isn't going to look like the factory 20 years from now.
Right, and then people point to Germany and they say, well, why can't the United States be more like Germany or Singapore, where you have a higher rate of manufacturing per capita? Part of the problem then is, and this is much more of an American cultural thing than a Canadian, is you want to have German manufacturing in the United States. The trade-off you have to accept is very high levels of unionization and wage preservation combined with slightly more expensive products. And if that were a trade-off the American public were willing to accept, which is, you can have higher manufacturing, but you're also going to have higher costs and capped wages, then maybe we could do that. But I don't see that being, in any sense, a cultural formula.
Well, but if you, the reality is the American automotive industry is live and well, but it's in South Carolina, it's in North Carolina,
And
it's
it's
in
paying,
Texas.
and it's paying a whole lot less than it was paying. I mean, wages went from $35 an hour plus benefits and pensions at 55 to $17 an hour with far fewer longer-term guarantees. So it is alive and well, but at a very different pay scale than it would have been before.
17 hours. Dollars an hour is better than zero.
Oh, I'm not.
for
I'm not. I'm
unemployment.
just saying
We
that
have-
that transition
there
hasn't
are
exactly.
also, there are other examples outside the auto sector as well.
Yeah.
Even recent ones. General Electric earlier this month moved jobs out of Erie, Pennsylvania to Fort Worth. About 60% of the wage level. Last year, Caterpillar moved jobs out of London, Ontario to Indiana, about half the wage level. And I think there's also a reality there that the pressure of driving down costs means that unless there's a really significant skill requirement, you're going to find that the manufacturing jobs, even if they stay within the United States or within North America, are going to move increasingly to places where the wage and benefit level can be lower.
On the manufacturing renaissance, actually, one thing is that I think there's a bit of a danger that we overgeneralize it, but I think if we look at what are the reasons underlying the sort of like onshoring
I
or the
do a lot of media. If I
renaissance.
can't overgeneralize, I just
Yes.
there's
No, I'm not saying that anyone here is overgeneralizing it, but I mean, looking at the reasons, I mean, part of it is because of the weak US dollar over the past couple of years, and also rising costs in China. The other reasons is because shale gas in the US has actually driven down things like electricity costs quite significantly. So, and that has benefited actually specific industries, like for instance, the chemical industries, which is very energy intensive. So you see actually more announcements in the past year about companies like Dow, for instance, relocating back more manufacturing back to the US. The other type of manufacturing which we see more announcements for them coming back to the US would be those which are more bulky items, heavy, difficult to ship, or expensive to ship, and hence needs to be closer to the end market. So I think like your GE, for instance, you talk about refrigerators and things like that. I mean, I think that would fit that bill. But for others, for which, let's say, the supply chain is very much pretty entrenched, let's say, in terms of semiconductor manufacturing, for instance, I think Asia will still be very much where the lion's share of the manufacturing is going to be. You can have pockets coming back to the US, but the question is how sustainable that.
But will that change? Will the shipping thing change
I have no
that?
problem. We can transport anything and at any weight at any just ask us to quote and we'll be there. So
You put it.
please take it off the record.
But if I
It's
could
not
just
an
make
issue,
one other caveat, though, is that at least what we were finding in the administration is if protection of your intellectual work product is core to your business. I mean, it isn't so much that the cost of labor has come down, but for the first time, I mean, when we came into office, we couldn't typically get any American business to join us when we challenged China on an unfair trade practice. Because the reality, they were all embedded in China and worried about. By the time we finished office, every one of them from GE and up were standing up and screaming, what are you going to do about trade theft and theft of trade securities? And the threat of losing what gives them that core business model has become first and foremost in the minds of many of these manufacturers, and they've made a decision with all the other factors that Zach mentioned, with the cost of our production going down, our innovation going up. If protecting that right is core to your business, you're beginning to see more and more businesses say, we'll either do it at home or we're going to be in a market in which we aren't quite at risk as we are right now in China. And the Chinese have done a number of things very, very well, but the issues around cybersecurity and data theft now are paramount for many, many of these manufacturers. And then finally, and I'll stop, but John's point about infrastructure and education makes all of this moot if we don't address the issue of skills management. And my short answer, again, the mayor in me is that Ronald Reagan may have gotten the curtain to come down and the rest of the world embraced democracy and open markets. But we got 3 billion competitors now that we didn't have. And if we're going to be as indifferent about educating our young people, if the rest of the world's indifferent about educating their young people as we are, China, India, Brazil, and Africa will have 1.5 billion of the most highly educated, motivated workers that could fill that chart that John referenced to at about a quarter the cost if we could. So the issue of investment in education and infrastructure is as paramount as anything else.
I'd like to just go back. Go ahead, John.
May I just
Go right
jump,
in.
because there's a connection here, and also to the German cultural issue, which is that when you look at the German educational practices, you've got a significant difference with North America as well, where essentially at the secondary school level, many very bright Germans choose an apprenticeship and skilled trade path, so that you've got about 40% of Germans who enter an apprenticeship program. That compares in the United States, I would suggest Canada's probably identical, at 0.3%.
Wow.
So we're not even in the same league in terms of building those kinds of skills. In contrast, this is one that really surprised me. 5% of janitors in the United States, 15% of taxi drivers in the United States, and 25% of retail sales clerks in the United States have university degrees. So we got a bit of a mismatch here between what we need and what we're producing, and that's exactly what is going to be in the minds of decision makers deciding where they're going to put the really advanced skill-seeking jobs that are going to be created in the future.
One thing I just want to, we don't have much time and I want to have a bit of time for questions from the room. I would like to just go back to China for a second and Eyal, perhaps have your viewpoint as a citizen of the world, and you, Damien, in the sense that, in China alone, it's predicted that by 2025, China will have about 200 cities with 1 million inhabitants, twice as many as today. That's in comparison with the United States that has only 9. And the proportion of Chinese who earn between $17,000 and $35,000 will increase from 6% to the population in 2010 to 50% in 2020. And I would like to know, in your opinion, what manufacturing sectors will benefit from that, and is this? It really is. It's a fact of life that's coming at us like a high-speed train. And
If
thank you very much.
I want to tell you, I had this discussion in China with a Chinese official, and I've told him, look, your middle class and the movements into the urban side of China is at a speed that I don't know how you guys are going to cope with, because you are building cities upon cities, and for them to build a city is for 10 million people. It's not a joke. And he told me, we are encouraging it. So I said, and what's the reason for that? I mean, because you're going to have more people living under concrete than people living in villages. And he said to me, look, the contribution of a farmer to the GDP of the country is the lowest. Once we move a farmer into an industrial base, into a manufacturing base, into any other base of production, his contribution to the GDP is substantially higher. And that's a process which they are following, and that's a process which we will have to face. This does not mean that it will strip the rest of the world from its manufacturing advantages. It only means that the rest of the world will have to rebalance its ability to be competitive and allow each country to concentrate on what they can contribute can be best at.
Although there is a dynamic, and Ron Kirk certainly knows this well, although most people would believe in that UFO survey, and UFO is a lot more than this, that U.S. exports to China are growing significantly more quickly than U.S. imports from China, even though the size remains widely differential. The U.S. will probably import $450 billion of goods from China, although I'd argue that the value add is massively less than that, but that doesn't show up. It will export about $120 billion of goods to China. That figure was $50, $60 billion 5 years ago. And at that rate of growth, particularly if you then add in your city's growth, all manufacturing sectors globally are going to benefit from that transition. And we're not even talking about India, and we're not talking about Indonesia with another 250 million people, and Brazil with another 200 million people. And at the rate of trajectory, in about 10 years, you're going to find U.S., if all things are equal, which of course they never are, but this is just a panel and we can talk about it, that U.S. exports to China will be in excess of $300 billion, and will be creeping up toward that imports. China is importing globally in terms of manufacturing, and some of that is food that the U.S. exports, much more than it is globally exporting. It's got a massive trade imbalance with the United States. It's almost in trade stasis with the rest of the world, and in fact in trade imbalance with Japan, with Korea, with Thailand, with Singapore. Because it's still, for all of its cities it's building, it's not making high-end power equipment, it's not making high tensile steel. It has no shale gas, hydraulic fracking technology. I mean, you want to talk about a potential export sector for the United States, where we have all this expertise and they have none, and they have massive energy needs. So, I think the optic around China, just like the one you talked about in trade in general, tends to focus on things that are becoming less important rather than those things that are really going to be driving things going forward.
So about rise of China and urbanization, of course, when Singapore, we look at, how we're going to grow in the future, it's not just leveraging on the rise of China, but actually the rise of Asia.
Right.
Just within Southeast Asia, 600 million people, GDP per capita twice that of India, for instance. And of course, India by itself is 1.2 billion people. And so this points to actually... So this points to actually three mega trends. Actually, first is of course rising middle class, rapid urbanization, as well as aging population. So then this leads, to John Paul, your original question about what are the industries, right? Which then we should look at. Definitely things to do with consumer, fast-moving consumer packaged goods, for instance. I think it's one for which Singapore, for instance, we see a lot of investments and activities there over the past few years, mainly because, with Asia now becoming the fastest growing market, and for some of them even the largest market, they have to invest, put in more manufacturing, R&D, even strategic decision making into where the heart of their center of gravity is. Right? So, Procter & Gamble is one example where, for instance, for certain businesses, like for their beauty care, personal care, baby care, actually, for those business units, the headquarters for those were actually set up in Singapore. Now, besides that, then things to do with urban planning or urban solutions would also be critical, whether we talk about clean technology, whether we talk about water solutions, for instance, traffic management. And then, of course, with linked to the aging population, I think healthcare would be big as well.
Not to be the killjoy, but our challenge for us, in the macro sense, if you look at this, as Zach says, all of our industries should remarkably prosper in a market that's going to grow the way China's is. But we would be less than honest with ourselves. You can't just sit here and declare and say, we're going to take 200 million people and move them off farms and put them in the cities. Doing what? And based on what technology? If you don't have an economy and a society that's built on producing and innovating, but is built on maybe copying better and faster what other people do, or outright taking what it is you do and appropriating it for their own.
But they do that really well.
And they do it better than anyone else. And I would say, if I give the president credit, we have not sought to, you cannot argue with the fact that but for the strength of China and the U.S.'s economy, this global recession would have been horrific. The fact that China is growing and contributing to the global economy is a good thing. But you cannot ignore the fact that we also have to confront China and say, if that growth model is built on basically appropriating what we have created in the United States, then we don't get that balance to where we all get to prosper. And just my word of caution is that there are challenges in China's growth models. And China is China's greatest advantage, I'm often asked what I've learned at this job, China's biggest advantage over the rest of the world, and I want to be careful, I'm not saying this is a good thing, but they have a highly efficient decision-making government. They're the only government I know that when they come up with a 5-year plan, somebody actually looks at it. And they actually operate against it.
In United autocracy works better than we thought it would.
Autocracy is a wonderful way. And their biggest advantage, they can make decisions and move on them now. None of us would want to live under that system, be governed under that system, but China is resolutely intent that they're not going to have the next Arab Spring. And you can tell I'm a former cabinet official now, but their calculus is that we will accept a lecture from the European Union and the United States and OECD about respecting intellectual property rights and nod our heads politely if it means we're going to find a way at any cost to produce the type of numbers that you referenced.
Right.
If it means avoiding what they are seeing happening in the Middle East. And for us, that raises very serious strategic policy and others in how we sort of balance China's aspirational growth, which could help us grow our economy, but making sure that it's done in a way that respects the rules and regulations of global trade and doesn't cripple our economy at the same time. So it could be a very good story.
I seem to recall the 60s with the Japanese following the same avenue, where intellectual and manufacturing copying was paramount to their and the basis of their industrial might at the time. Was it in engineering, in electronics, in every other aspect? The US was a good model base, the German was a good model base, and they just copied it and became second largest economy in the world at the time. And the whole world was scared that they're going to lose ground to the Japanese. But it's evolutionary. Once the Japanese reach a certain level of saturation and stability, right, it is shifting to somebody else. It shifted the Koreans. From the Koreans, it shifted to the Chinese. From the Chinese, it will shift to the Vietnamese, and so on and so forth. That's the way the world works.
Yeah, and to bring the ray of sunshine, Ron, the Chinese are now filing almost as many patents as the U.S.
Yep.
And the practice of copying what somebody else did is time honored. You refer to the Japanese. Charles Dickens toured reading his books in the United States because he said it was the only way he could make money from the United States because they didn't have a copyright law to protect him. So this has happened over centuries, and I think as they build in China increasing stakes in innovation, in invention, in science and technology, and begin to seek similar kinds of protections,
Right.
we'll see that what really is at issue here is the ability to enforce your rights in China, to see that there are ways to pursue patent litigation that are actually enforced by independent tribunals, that you can get some remedy for infringement when it occurs. And as that stake increases, I think we're going to see that evolve as well.
I should have taken up from Dickens. One of my books called Superfusion about China and the United States sold 30,000 copies in China. But as far as I know, it may have sold substantially more. For which I saw, I think, $4,000 and up front. And I've never, I suppose there's a royalty statement somewhere.
You should go on the lecture circuit and read it.
No, I apparently missed out
Too late
on the
for that.
Dickens model. So.
That's the way.
So we're coming to a close. I wanted to just go quickly in respect of our audience. If you have any questions, can we get a mic over here, please? Right here in the second row.
Just taking the core of the topic that we were talking about, which is manufacturing moving back to the U.S., and I'm taking U.S.-China trade surplus as a proxy to this. If I take the 7-year trend, the surplus has been rising. It's now running at something like $220 to $230 billion a year. Does anyone on the panel believe that that number is going to change its trend over the next couple of years?
Well, I mean, I do think the gap is going to close somewhat because exports are rising more, not because imports are rising less. And again, not to beat the dead horse, I think that there's a lot more value that accrues to the United States in that trade gap than we measure. And that's a highly, I understand, contentious point. I happen to think it's right, because we all think we're right. But in that case, I think it's less important than it looks.
And I'm just only quickly at the point Damien made. I mean, if you believe some of the economic models we used at the White House, if you took what we now call our trade deficit with China and you called it our trade deficit with Southeast Asia, it's about the same number. China just did a remarkable job of congealing and sucking up what used to happen in other economies around Asia. But I think, instead of everybody cussing their tennis shoes being made in China, you aren't going to have to wait very long because they're all going to be made in Vietnam.
Exactly.
So, but I think to Zach's point, the relative number probably may not change that much.
The Chinese shoes will be made in Vietnam, which is
Yes.
even more way.
I think I read along statistics. Maybe it is worthwhile to give it some more emphasis because today these statistics were derived originally from nation-to-nation trading.
Right.
So as a result of that, we are ignoring the added value issue.
Right.
An iPod coming into United States is labeled as $120 when China is only getting $450.
Right.
Stanford University did that. An iPad is now $300, but China got $11. So I think I want the panel, if in fact with all your government connections and network and the institutes, is it time for us to develop a new economic model so that we can truly measure the value trading across the world so that we can now make proper policy decisions rather than based on this obsolete statistics?
Well, I mean, the OECD is trying to do this. The IMF and the World Bank have their own participation at some of the Federal Reserve branches as well as the Asian Development Bank. Part of the problem is until companies are able to report and do in fact report to customs offices where the component breakdown is of their products, we simply lack the mechanisms to actually do this globally for thousands upon thousands of products. I mean, it took economists months of hard work to do that for the iPhone, right? And because there's no Apple doesn't report, it could report its Qualcomm chips, but then where would it report the Qualcomm chips as being from? Would they be from San Diego? Would they be from Flextronics? Would they be from Singapore? So it's not just an issue of the conceptual. It's actually a problem of just the mechanical of companies reporting their own supply chain, which there's just no mechanism to do right now.
Well, we're coming to a close, and I would like to just ask the panel members one last question. And I know this may be hard for you, Ron, so listen carefully. But I'm going to ask each of you, if you want, because we touched a wide range of subjects today in the manufacturing spectrum. And if you want the people here to leave the room with just one idea, one thing to remember from what we talked about today, what would that be? And we'll start with Jamie.
No, I mean, I think that ultimately we can't see manufacturing just solely as production. Actually, a lot of the value is derived from other parts of the value chain, and that's why the Apple is a very good example of that. Actually, most of the value comes from the design.
Right.
And if you notice the back of my iPad here, it says design in Cupertino. It comes first before assembled in China. So that's important. And that's how Singapore we view the sector as well.
Zach?
Thank you.
Yeah, basically, to echo exactly what Damien said, countries and economies are not built on a manufacturing base. They're built on the capacity of their societies, whether it's education or culture, to generate sufficient growth and material needs to satisfy their populations, which are inherently based on their ability to create the ideas and the systems to do so, not based on their ability to build factories that make stuff.
Ron?
I'll give you a quote from, I think, one of America's most unappreciated philosophers since it's baseball season. Only Yogi Berra could say, the future ain't what it used to be. But my biggest deal is America should not fear that. It's different. But I would go back to John's point. We can compete, we can win, but the underpinning of that is having the skilled workforce to meet the needs of these new different innovators and manufacturers.
John?
The way I put it is, if you think education is expensive, try the price of ignorance. It's all about learning, skills, knowledge, and that will be the key to our economic success in the future.
That's a good line coming from a Canadian. I mean, that's very witty.
What's this coming from a Canadian?
I don't know these guys. I don't know. AL,
Texas
please.
version of Bless Your Heart.
Yeah. I don't know, Canadian or not, I like what you said. But this is my privilege because policy making and politics is not my this. But I think that the whole issue of manufacturing is totally exaggerated as such. Why? Because when you are starting up as a manufacturing country, you are actually dealing with industries which, if they are to be revived today, you will not find the people to do them. Why? Because the people have advanced out of them. They either went into service, they went into production, they went into other things which gave them better life. Bringing back what used to be is going backwards, which means that the world, once opened up, should become a platform that everybody is relating to as one, and not we must have what we used to have, hence let's bring manufacturing back. Manufacturing is not for this country anymore. Manufacturing is for Mexico, is for other parts of the world, and then it will migrate elsewhere. So the whole issue of manufacturing or migration of manufacturing should be dealt as such, and manufacturing should have the ability to migrate to where it is best based and best and being worked in the most efficient way. And we should compensate by migration of manufacturing by educating the new generation into creating robots, and the robots will do the manufacturing and the menial jobs for us. And we should be sitting above them and monitoring them, and then give them even a voting right one day.
Thank you so much, AL. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you to the Milken Institute, and thank you to the audience.
We have a session that's starting presently, so if you could please file out quickly, I'd really appreciate that.